Welcome to 1+1. My name is Rosie Batty. My guest today is Amani Haydar. She's a writer, an artist, and a family violence survivor. And in 2015, her father killed her mother. We sat down and talked about grief, strength, and her finding her voice. Amani Haydar, welcome to 1+1.
Thank you, Rosie.
We're surrounded by your artwork, and I'm a really big fan. It's just beautiful. Tell me about your art.
So my art tends to explore both myself and the women around me and themes relating to women's lives more broadly. My painting, which is here today, is a self-portrait in which I'm holding a picture of my mum and she's holding a picture of her mum.
So it's 3 generations of women, and your family are from Lebanon.
That's right. So my mum migrated to Australia in the late 80s. She left behind her family and she came without any of her siblings when she married my dad. And she really missed her family and her mum and her friends who she left behind, and I think found it a little bit difficult to transition into this new life.
I can understand that. I mean, I've been here a similar period of time, and there is a significant adjustment as you develop networks of friends and family.
I think for my mum, it was initially tinged with some sense of excitement and adventure because she was quite young. She hadn't travelled anywhere before. She had recently finished high school. She'd grown up through war and occupation. So for her, there was a lot of potential and hope in the idea of moving overseas, getting married and starting your life. And I think once she arrived, she realised that it was a lot more difficult than she'd imagined. And she was quite disappointed by how my father turned out to be, and a lot of her expectations weren't met. And I think before she developed her language skills and started knowing where to go and building up her networks, it would have been quite isolating, as it was for migrant women at that time.
Your mum, she seemed to really work very hard to really connect in with her language, with her studies, all the things that I think that were very inspiring.
Yeah, so once she'd had 4 kids, she began to pursue a career for herself. She studied at TAFE, she did some community courses, and she got involved in community work and social work. And I think that was something that really drove her and excited her and gave her a way of building those networks and connecting with people and helping people who were vulnerable or also recently arrived in Australia or experiencing any kind of hardship and difficulty. So I think for her, that was a source of passion and motivation and something that she felt she could really contribute to.
And gave her a real sense of purpose and direction.
Absolutely.
Police were called to a unit on Valdez Street in Bexley after reports a woman had been attacked. They arrived to find 45-year-old Salwa Haydar dead.
And Amani, you were 5 months pregnant when your mum was killed. I can't imagine holding a pregnancy through such a turbulent, traumatic and devastating time. How did you get through that?
It was really traumatic. It was really difficult because it meant parking a lot of that grief, putting it aside for temporarily in order to just manage and be okay and focus on the fact that I have to bring a child into the world in circumstances that I could not have possibly even imagined or anticipated. So it was a real struggle. But day by day, I began to build my confidence. After my daughter was born, I was able to start finding ways to make the stress and the load of caring for a newborn more and more manageable. But I don't know how I got through it. It was really hard.
You know, often people will say, you are so strong, I don't know how you do it, and you kind of think, well, what choice have I got? You know, it is about survival, and she's each day getting up. But, you know, for myself, I wasn't carrying a child within me. And I you know, certainly the shock, the trauma, and the toll it took on my body, it's beyond words what you have to delve in to find. But as a white middle-class woman, I was very aware of the privilege I have and the public support I had. And, you know, the news of my son being murdered reached England, where I come from. I felt incredibly supported. What was your experience? Was it the same for you as a Muslim woman?
It was a mixed experience. So there were comments on Facebook that were Islamophobic, that blamed the violence, that blamed my faith for the violence. And I thought, well, that's just an extension of the victim blaming that women experience all the time anyway. And there were also comments from members of the public who wanted to justify or excuse or explain my dad's violence by saying that he must have been mentally ill and making assumptions about our lives. And it's already such a vulnerable, disempowering time where one of the definitive parts of experiencing trauma is that you feel like you've lost control over your life and you've lost your sense of safety. And I didn't feel safe speaking about what had happened because the media had been for a long time complicit in the Islamophobia that I'd witnessed growing up, and that I felt that I was quite caught between speaking out about the injustice that had been committed against my mum and then subjecting myself to a potential backlash.
And Amani, I've spent nearly 8 years now talking about victim blaming and trying to shift the blame that is often placed on the woman. And as you said, the ignorance or the misunderstandings, and because of such a horrific act, people try to explain it away because they can't accept that this was a choice. Mm-hmm. And so for me, when I lost my son, people blamed me for not keeping him safe enough. How could I have made the decisions I did? But by speaking out, you do put yourself in a position for backlash. And that's the thing, I suppose, is that by experiencing backlash, we know that we're making change. I know that you realised your parents' relationship wasn't healthy, it wasn't happy, but I don't think any of you really saw it as a violent relationship with risk and that this could ever happen. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't quite have the language for abuse at the time while all these events were unfolding. And even though the trial took place 2 years later, I was still at a stage where I was learning to understand what had happened, how that context could lead to this sort of violence. That was a really difficult thing to appreciate. And I remember being quite surprised when I read some information and statistics in reports that actually said that in a lot of homicides, up to 50% of the ones that were studied in this particular paper had no prior reports of violence. And that to me was quite shocking at first, but also it gave me a way of contextualising what had happened and understanding that this wasn't a rare thing or an anomaly. It was actually a frequent occurrence and a thing that we don't know enough about perhaps in relation to male violence, about how it can take place unexpectedly. It can take place in situations where the abuser doesn't fit a stereotype, doesn't seem like they're capable of something so violent and aggressive. So for me, I had to really process and accept and understand those facts before I could feel confident speaking up about them. And I'm really conscious about being responsible in my advocacy or being responsible in any kind of public appearance, because this is an important issue and lives are at stake and people's lives are not entertainment. And I think it's really important that when we tell these stories and we speak about them publicly, we do it in a way that's empowering for other women, empowering for other victim survivors, and factual and evidence-based. And that's something that I was really conscious of. So it took me a while to get to a position where I thought, you know what, I actually do feel confident saying something about this, and I do have the skills and the knowledge that I need to address it. But all the while, I was learning about this stuff and developing my literacy around race and racism as well, because I thought this is going to be part of the conversation too.
I think what we're talking about in the context of your family, and the same for myself, is coercive control, where we're not actually experiencing physical violence. As a society, we haven't had the language before now, and we're actually just beginning to talk about this in a way that people are starting to be able to grasp and understand?
So in the process of sharing my story and in the process of writing my book, I wanted to draw out some of those more insidious events and moments where it might have been a red flag, but without that literacy and without that awareness, it's really hard for an outsider to the relationship, even if it's your own parents, to identify those things and perceive them as a threat. It's really difficult for the children in abusive relationships to find ways to articulate their parents' relationship, especially if they don't have exposure to that language, especially if they haven't really discussed it outside of the home, because a lot of what goes on at home is treated as private and children are often given that message, or it's coded to them in a way that doesn't feel appropriate to ask anyone.
And at the time of your mum's death, Amani, were you well supported? Have you found that people have surprised you? They've come into your life and you've developed new friendships, and people that you are sad and had to grieve the loss of relationships that were important to you. How have you felt after losing your mum in that way?
The murder created so many fractures throughout my family because my mum and my dad were from the same community, and it was quite a close-knit community, and there were all these different competing interests. And I think people were concerned about what would happen to my dad. They were concerned about how that would make them look bad or guilty by association. People were in denial about how violent his actions were. And I think a lot of that denial was projected towards my sisters and I at times. And I think that empathy was quickly withdrawn when I was a bit more outspoken and a bit more willing to call out the behaviour of my dad and say, quite frankly, no, this was not okay, and this is part of a continuum of events. And it was really something that he perhaps had been capable of all along, and maybe we overlooked it. So for me, I started to feel a lot of resistance from people who perhaps didn't have the same insight I had or didn't have the same awareness as I had.
Or capacity.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the other thing too, is, you know, that some people you have to accept don't have the capacity, and that's deeply distressing. But you can't change people, can you? They will continue to hold on to their beliefs and how they say things. And I think it's been, you know, for myself and my family, it's been a big learning curve. Luke's father was killed that same night that he murdered Luke, and I feel that was a relief for me on many levels. I don't have to think about him. I don't have to think or battle in a conflict about him. My grief is purely about my son, and I understand for you that must be a difficult journey in relation to your father. How do you process that, Amani, as your journey keeps continuing? How do you sit with that?
I think it's such an interesting question, because a lot of people assume when they speak to me that I also felt a sense of grief about my father, and I don't think I did. I was disgusted, confused, shocked. To an extent, there was a sense of pity there, but I didn't feel that I needed or wanted to grieve him. I felt that what was more important to me was accountability, and I had a real hope that he would be accountable and that he would hold himself accountable. And that was perhaps a little bit naive. And I really thought that, no, he won't make us go to trial. He won't make his daughters testify in a courtroom. He won't make us face the media. He won't make us go through the trauma of sitting in that room. And then every time I kind of held on to that hope, I was let down and disappointed by the fact that he would be doing basically anything in his power to avoid accountability and minimise the consequences, and also minimise our pain and our grief in the process. And part of that is owing to the way in which our legal system functions. And part of that is also what abusers do. They do extend that abuse. They abuse by proxy through family members. They use the system and they leverage it.
Yeah. it's really confronting, isn't it, to think that somebody so close to you, so involved in your life, the very person that you should be able to respect, feel safe with, is utterly capable of being so uncaring, being so callous, being so narcissistic, if that's the right word. Amani, I don't think we talk about grief well. I think that's another subject where we don't quite know what grief-stricken people should behave like. What does grief look like to you?
Grief for me initially was a huge, scary void. And I know that's an unoriginal way to describe it, but it was what it felt like. And it felt that it would be impossible to overcome. It felt insurmountable. I did feel like my father had ruined my life at first. I couldn't envisage a future. I was thinking in survival mode. I was thinking about, what do I do next? What do I organise next? Who do I speak to about this thing? How do I sort out my mum's estate? How do I look after my sisters? How do I look after my children? Those practical things were so overwhelming in those days because I didn't have the emotional scope to handle all of it. But I think you do grow around the grief, and I think you do find ways to cope and contribute meaningfully to conversations and contribute meaningfully to the lives of the people around you. And that can be a really healing thing to do. And we don't speak about grief in a way that empowers people who are grieving. And we, in particular, don't respect the grief of victims of crime. I think people are quick to avoid that. It's uncomfortable. They don't really want to sit with that kind of pain and acknowledge the fact that this can happen to you too.
And I know for myself, when I look back, and as I look back now, I can see, while I was Australian of the Year, I was totally distracting myself from the worst of the pain. I felt I was experiencing as much pain as I could bear, but I can see now I was so driven to avoid just being that I did so much, and I don't regret that. That was my way of coping. That was my way of getting through. But I didn't know that I was experiencing PTSD and anxiety and trauma, and there was this melting pot of overwhelming emotions that sometimes I went to bed at night time, or I was at home alone feeling self-loathing, hating myself because I'd upset somebody, I'd acted angrily, I'd responded in ways I wasn't proud of. I wasn't being the ideal victim. I wasn't being the person that they expected me to be. And yes, I would turn up and talk to the media, and at that point they would say I was dignified or I was graceful or I was, and I think, but I wasn't like that all the time. And so what about anger? Because I talk about anger sometimes, and I think that's always something I've struggled with a little. How would you describe your anger?
There was a concept I came across in Islamic philosophy where the scholar defined anger as the drive that allows us to identify when an injustice has happened and take action in response to it. And I've tried to lean into that as much as possible because anger is stigmatised, and women who are angry are considered undignified, and people, again, withdraw their empathy very quickly when you don't behave in those model victim ways. And I learned gradually to embrace my own anger. And I remember going to therapy early on and saying, I'm so angry and I don't know what to do with it. I don't know where to express it. I'm embarrassed about this level of anger that I have. And my counsellor started me with journaling, and she said, just allocate 30 minutes a day to being really angry and allowing yourself to feel that emotion. And that was such a turning point for me. And the more I leaned into that feeling and the more I gave it a voice and allowed it to be present and have a voice, I felt better. And I felt that I wasn't suffocating in that anger. I wasn't trying to suppress a very natural response to a very extreme violence. And I think that informs everything I do now. I think embracing that anger and using it to identify where things are wrong and what action needs to be taken can be such a wonderful motivator.
And you've got a lovely husband, you've got 2 children. How have they helped you? And is this where you get your strength from?
I think the strength I draw from my kids is particularly in relation to them being a source of joy and a source of fun and forcing me to slow down and be childlike. And it can be so difficult when you're carrying trauma and when you're carrying a burden or when you're involved in any kind of advocacy to actually take time out to reconnect with your own inner child. And that's what really needs the most healing. So for me, being a mother has allowed me to see my own flaws, to notice my own behaviour, my responses to stress and things like that, and to become more attuned to what's going on around me. And my children have given me something to sometimes distract from the hard work that I'm doing, or to allow me to be a child again and I share my work with them. I allow them to witness the art making process. I work from home and they've grown up being surrounded by stories and creativity, and I hope that that gives them a sense of inspiration as well. So I learn from them just as much as they hopefully learn from me, and I think that's been a real source of strength.
You've written a book about your experience, Amani, and I really enjoyed reading the book. You call the book The Mother Wound. Tell me about the title and tell me what that meaning is.
So the mother wound is this concept in popular psychology that I came across a couple of years ago. I was actually preparing an exhibition to hold at the Fairfield City Museum and Gallery that we're in right now. And that ended up being the title of the show. And it's an idea that women pass on trauma or project trauma or anger onto their children unwittingly after experiencing living through patriarchy and living through all the emotional and physical damage that does. And I thought, well, what responsibility do I have to heal myself? What power do I have to heal myself and to not pass this on to the next generation? And of course, that's not entirely my own responsibility. I think we need to have the systems and structures in place that prevent this from happening in the first place. I think we need systems and structures in place to allow people to recover properly and access the help they need. But I wanted to look at, where do I fit in with all of this? How do I make meaning out of all of this trauma and all of this loss and avoid passing on that pain to the next generation? And that became a really interesting point of inquiry for me, and that grew into the book.
I'm really proud of my book. It's something that I felt, my story that I've shared with Luke, the good and the bad, it's in there. And I'm not sure whether I felt it was therapeutic at the time, but it's kind of a relief that's captured. I don't have to think through that detail anymore. I don't have to worry about events. They're in there forever. What impact has the book had on you?
I really relate to what you've said. I think sometimes the process is really messy, but the outcome is a real relief. And I started writing in a sort of disciplined way after I began my journaling process through therapy, through counselling, and I started writing my victim impact statement to prepare for my dad's trial. And when I got to the end of that, I thought there's so much more to say and there's so much more to do, and I need to keep up this writing practice. And I found it to be incredibly empowering because it gave me back my agency, and it allowed me to tell my mum's story and my own story in my own words. And the writing process itself was incredibly difficult. And I think I might have even underestimated how hard it would be. I read through the judgment for the first time. I read through the transcripts from the court proceedings. I read through details that I hadn't known before. And we were in lockdown because of COVID at the time that I was doing some of the messiest, most difficult parts of the writing process. And I really had to balance that out with some self-care. And I really had to sit with a lot of feelings that were quite negative and work with a counsellor to kind of talk through some of the things that had come up because of that process. But at the end, and now, I feel that it was the most healing thing I could have done. It allowed me to remember things I'd forgotten. It allowed me to document my grandmother's story and my mum's story and put their lives on the page for people to witness. And it just allowed me to get a sense of closure that I don't think I had gotten out of the trial process or through anything else.
Amani, you didn't set out to be a family violence advocate. You were a lawyer. You've changed careers. Is this as a result of that?
I don't think I define myself by my job anymore, but I had started developing a creative practice that included both art and writing. And I think they come together with my advocacy. I think art became very healing for me, as did writing, and I felt that that liberated me from the rules of the courtroom. It liberated me from the rules of evidence that had made my experience of my dad's trial so difficult and so confronting, and really turned me off being in the courtroom. I didn't feel like I could go back to that space, and nor did I feel like it was important to me anymore. I think you can think of justice as something a lot broader than what the legal system offers, and I think it can mean different things to different people, and different victim survivors that I've spoken to have a totally different take on what justice looks like for them, and that's important to respect and to value. And I think that should even be reflected in policy. It should be reflected in the opportunities that we make available for people so that they can engage in their own healing process in a way that makes sense for them.
So many people look at what we've endured or experienced, and I used to think, people look up to me, but no one would want to be me. And it's a real stigma. Mm-hmm. But as time progresses, I love the fact that people brighten up when they see me. They smile, they're joyful about actually meeting with me. I can be myself again. I don't have to feel the pressure of acting a certain way or being a certain way. And I feel that my trauma has subsided, and I am more myself again in ways that I never thought possible. And it sounds to me that with all the work that you do and all the talent that you have, that you're really embracing, that you are similarly in that space.
Absolutely, I relate to everything that you've just said so strongly. I often say that I don't want pity, I want solidarity and action, and if you can't deliver on that, then you need to get out of the way and let us do what we need to do. And I think I really have found healing through my art and through my writing in a way that has allowed me to return to myself. And I've validated my childhood experiences for myself. I've validated my trauma for myself. I've allowed it to be messy and complicated. I've allowed it to come out at unexpected times, and then I've dealt with that and responded to it and learned about it so that I feel empowered to keep going on my own healing journey. And I think that's really important. I think sometimes we think that a victim's story ends when the legal proceedings end, or when the news is no longer news anymore. And really that's just the start. And I think we definitely need to invest in allowing victims to have that opportunity to heal after they've been victimised.
Amani Haydar, thank you for joining me and sharing your story on 1+1.
Thank you for having me, Rosie.